That was all right. Quick mic check. Everybody hear me? Welcome to day 2 of the UBBA Summit and Plugfest. You have made it to the fun part, so congratulations. We're going to build on that fantastic panel here that we saw earlier. We've got an exciting topic to discuss and a great group of panelists here. You know, building a private LTE network is a lot like other utility construction projects. Gil talked about the largest battery that they have, which is what's really called a pumped storage solution. Water is pumped at night when energy is cheap up into the mountain, into the man-made lake, and then gravity pulls it down, during the high usage hours where energy is quite expensive. So that land is very unique and it's purpose-built for that function. In private LTE network buildouts, the equivalent of land is spectrum. And the FCC's realignment of the 900 megahertz band has really brought beachfront quality or top of the mountain quality spectrum for these utilities to build these networks on. After you get past the land choice, the next thing that you have to figure out is what are the products, what are the devices, the steel, the metal, the software, the computers, everything else to build whatever it is that you're going to build on that land. Might be renewable generation, might be transmission, might be a substation. In private LTE networks, that's where these panelists come in. Their companies provide this equipment that creates the private LTE network. Today we're going to talk about their decision to provide this equipment in this beachfront quality spectrum band, their inclusion in the Anterix active ecosystem, and their outlook on the future of private LTE for utilities and critical infrastructure providers. So what we're going to do is, for each of the panelists on this first question, I'd like for you to start with a brief introduction, and then we'll roll through it. We're pushed for time just a little bit, but we are adaptable, and we can make this happen. So Chris, with GE Renewable Energy. So, Google's a great thing. It makes you seem really smart when you're up here and doing these things. Your company roots go all the way back to 1889 and Thomas Edison. So after your brief introduction, tell me how GE Renewable Energy continues that long history towards a decarbonized electric grid, and how does private LTE fit into that goal of what you're trying to do? Oh, you got to turn it on.
All right, yeah, so I'm Chris Trabold. I'm the general manager of GE's industrial communications business, which is housed in GE Renewables. We've been an inaugural member of UBBA because we believe in the mission of bringing the vendor and utility community together to provide these broadband networks of the future. And to your question on GE, so GE, yes, since 1889, innovative solutions for the grid. But as we transform into the future, there's obviously a heightened use of renewables. In order to do that, a lot more control on the grid. And to do that, you need low latency, high performance solutions, which is what LTE provides. And private LTE is just a natural evolution for the utilities to perform this function going forward.
Great. Ron, we're going to move to you next. Your company roots go all the way back to 1910. It's a long history of successful deployment of electricity solutions around the globe. You guys you've seen it all, pretty much done it all. Communications has always been part of that product line from the very beginning. So what advantages do you see that private LTE networks, this new phase, this new generation evolution brings for utilities?
Thanks, Mike. And good morning. Great to be here. I'm Ron Krzoska we're now Hitachi-ABB. We've gone through a rebranding, so our branding isn't quite up to where we are in our booth, but looking forward to expanding our influence in the industry as part of Hitachi-ABB. With respect to how do we see the migration to private LTE and broadband in general, that's been a core competence as part of our grid automation, or if you think all things digital in the grid, as part of Hitachi-ABB and now Hitachi-ABB. And why do we feel it's so important? When we look at what do we need to do in the next generation of the grid, we kind of think about a couple of different aspects of that. The first is looking at the resiliency and the reliability of the grid. What do we need? We need to make sure that we've got good storm recovery, identification, notification and the ability where appropriate to automatically recover. And then the second thing, as we move to decarbonization and more renewables and electrification, we need to make sure that we can support the distributed energy and the power control schemes associated with that. So building on broadband in general, moving into the private LTE ecosystem provided by 3GPP and specifically using the Anterix spectrum enables that in a wide scale, arguably the most successful interoperable and open ecosystem that exists with over 1.5 billion smartphone devices in a year. So we think it's a natural migration for our broadband strategy.
Great. Okay, we're going to go on to Dan. Dan, your company roots go back to 1905. Now, most of us, and I was in the utility industry for 30 years, we think of Landis-Gyr as being primarily a metering company, but in the research that I did, actually communications has been a big part of that all throughout the history of your company. So what's the Landis-Gyr vision for private LTE and more specifically, the 900 megahertz, what I call beachfront or top of the mountain spectrum that the FCC has brought to this group?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Dan Robertson. I'm responsible for global innovation here at Landis-Gyr. Yeah, most people, when they think about Landis-Gyr, think that we're a metering company, and you might also know us as a networking company. When you think of Gridstream, it's a proprietary mesh solution, which is evolving into a standards-based mesh solution. But our vision now is to give the customer what they want. I mean, isn't that great? To give them what they really want, rather than trying to sell them something. I know that's novel. But what that really means is choose your own network. If you want a mesh network, we'll provide that. If you want PLC, we'll also provide that. But if you want LTE, we'll provide you with a LTE solution that's as flexible as you can imagine. So what that really means is if you want to go public carrier, we'll support any public carrier that's available in your region. And when it comes down to private LTE, we're doing a lot of work with our friends at Anterix to support 900 megahertz. We have customers we're deploying with and testing with. Also, if you're interested in CBRS, we're doing the same thing with CBRS, Southern Link also, as well as FirstNet. So it's all about choice and it's about flexibility and giving the customer what they really want. And also making it easy or easier. Easy is a bad term to use, but easier, meaning we want to be a key part of the ecosystem so that when we deploy a solution to a customer, we make sure that it's tested on the customer's network infrastructure of choice. That means we test in Nokia labs, Ericsson labs, and potentially in the future, Motorola labs. So we want to make the ecosystem work and we want to be a key part of that. And that's what an open standards-based ecosystem means to us.
Okay, great. We're going to shift to Steve. Steve, you're the newbie here. Your company was founded in 2014, just a mere 80, 90, I could do the math here later, than some of these others. But you've been around. You've been a key player in the evolution of IoT technology in a number of industries. So tell us about Automation. We got a chance to see the pull tilt sensor demo yesterday. Tell us about the products that you're bringing to the market, and I think also some of maybe the business intelligence and other tools.
Sure, and is up. Can you hear me? All right. Well, thanks. First of all, it's great to be a new guy. It's great to be a young guy again. Atomation is really about turning the business model that we've all kind of grew up with on its head. If you think about it, we've all grown up in an environment where computing is rare and expensive and people are relatively cheap. So how do we develop systems? I was Emerson's CIO for a lot of years too. So, I've been doing this for a while, and it was always about connecting things with wires, bringing all that information to a central point, and then using bigger machines, better algorithms, and everything else like that to figure out what's going on. Atomation has had the ability to grow up in a world where computing is cheap and people are expensive. So what we do is to have devices like this is an Atom, that not only see what's going on in their environment, but then make decisions on whether it's good or bad, and then only really communicate if you need to know what's going on. So taking that intelligence that we had trapped inside of the data center, pushing it all the way out to where things are, and do that first level of analysis right there. The net effect is everything gets simple. And as things get simple, they get more cost effective and deployment gets faster. So it's really about changing the way you think about the equation and then kind of thinking about the problem inside out. And we think by doing that for a lot of things, not control, but for things that you want information about, it's a much easier and cheaper way to go about the problem.
Great. I want to remind everybody there's a really fabulous slick sheet in your gray backpacks there, and there's a wonderful article in here from Burns & McDonnell. This is all about the Anterix Active Ecosystem, which is our subject of the panel today. Great article in here from Burns & McDonnell, things you need to be sure that you do right, things like project management, scope creep control, executive sponsors. There's also a wonderful article from the Anterix Chief Operating Officer, Ryan Gerbrandt, on this active ecosystem. So, Steve, well, you got the microphone. Let's turn our questions in that direction. So what does Automation see as the benefits of joining the Anterix active ecosystem? And really, what are you going to try and do with it?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, because you on the one hand, you sit there and say, well, if all this intelligence is happening on the device, why do you need an ecosystem like this? And the answer is it's crucial. Because if you've got all of that intelligence trapped on the device itself and can't go and communicate out, can't integrate with everything else, information that can't be shared is essentially useless. I mean, you put something in a vault and never access it, what's it worth? So the atoms need to exist in a very dynamic environment where connectivity is assured, particularly when you're talking about a utility type of infrastructure. We're out on poles in the middle of nowhere. If you don't have the connectivity, I mean, who knows if something has happened on that device? So having something like the Anterix ecosystem, we think is a vital component in order to be able to provide a solution.
Okay, and continuing in inverse order, we're going to go back to Dan. Dan, I want to talk a little bit about standards, and Gil gave us a great challenge this morning trying to remember what that cell phone looked like. I had to bring it up on my Google there while he was talking about it, and I can remember that cell phone and thinking, wow, I'd never pay that much for a cell phone, but good for you and those Commodore 64 folks. But does anybody remember these standards? Remember Betamax? Remember Token Ring? Anybody else? Who in the audience? Shout out one or two more. Come on, what's one of an outdated one? What's that? X25? ATM, yes. Arctan, there we go. What's that? Pity? Yeah. Okay, so apparently there's a lot of experience here in the room with standards that that didn't make it. And so my question for you, Dan, is how do you see the global LTE standards serving utilities and their field communications requirements going forward? Utilities make investments for long periods of time. They'll have devices in their networks that last 60, 70 more years. So tell us how LTE is going to carry us and make sure that these decisions that utilities are making now are future-proof.
I think there's a couple of answers to this, and I've actually changed my answer now because I heard somebody yesterday say, what are the utilities doing within the standards bodies? They mentioned 3GPP and ETSI. I'm a member of ETSI. I don't recall seeing a user group covering utility use cases. I've not seen that. Now, maybe there is one.
There is one as part of UBBA. We do have.
So that's something I would say is a great vehicle to be part of and actively participate. The reason I say that is because presumably it's covering private LTE. If there are aspects of the standards that don't cover what the utilities use cases need to cover, then I would definitely recommend that we try and actively push that, because if you want to drive the future of the standards, the mobile IoT standards going forward, then being an active participant will help drive that. One example of that I've been working on personally is battery endpoint technology, and there are updates in release 14 and 15 around power saving and things like that. But if there are specific areas that we want the utility industry and the ecosystem to have a voice on, I definitely recommend that. My original answer was going to be around standards help, drive adoption and they help drive choice. So if you're deploying on LTE, whether it's public or private, you have a broad choice of consumer devices, smartphones, tablets, wearables, anything you can imagine. You can jump on that whole evolutionary cycle. Where's that going to be in 5 years? Doesn't matter, but you know you can probably support it from an IoT use case perspective. Obviously, AMI, DA use cases today and in the future. We have that support, but also into smart cities. So if you build your ubiquitous network, your multipurpose network, then you know that you can support use cases you haven't even imagined yet. So LTE from a standards perspective is a great bet. There's a huge amount of money being invested, especially when you look at 5G. And another area is around integration. You know that you can integrate into this framework that you've built, this network that you've built, because that's where the money's going. Follow the money. You know, this is America. Follow the money, right? So that's a kind of convoluted answer, and it's kind of backwards, but hopefully that gives you some things to think about.
And this is the fun part of the morning, so that fits in perfectly. All right, Ron, we're going to move to you. You and I have had some conversations about this, and we're going to just build right on to Dan's answer about the need for groups that represent utilities to come together and be sure in part of these global standards groups to advocate for the somewhat unique needs for utilities. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. And I think one of the key things, it's fantastic to be part of the 3GPP ecosystem, right? And I said earlier, 1.5 billion devices a year, primarily driven by the smartphone market. I think and within 3GPP, there's multiple standards that are defined. I'll focus mainly on the air interface because that's what impacts our device, which is the user equipment. But there's others. So this, I think, conversation can be applied more generically and broadly. But one of the biggest challenges we need to have is when we deviate from the smartphone roadmap in terms of chipsets and capabilities, we need to do that consciously. And when we do that consciously, we also need to make sure that we do it as an entire organization. So as a call to action, we need to make sure that we talk about the utility needs for feature X, Y, or Z. I mean, the Anterix folks have done a fantastic job of seeding the ecosystem by getting band 839 duplex offset into some of the chipsets. But what we're seeing is it's not as broadly adopted as the smartphone chipsets are. So when you think about economies of scale in terms of price and time to market, wherever possible, let's make sure we stay on the smartphone roadmap because they've got 1.5 billion devices they ship a year. And when we need to deviate, make a conscious decision, and we need to put together a business case. So it's a call to action for UBBA, the entire utility industry, to understand how big is the opportunity so that we can drive that adoption into the ecosystem and the underlying chipset providers that we're really dependent on to deploy these solutions successfully.
Fantastic. You know, and that's really such a great example of why this group was created, the Utility Broadband Alliance. This is where it happens. What Ron is talking about that we absolutely need to do, this is where we do it. So get involved in the working groups. Dan mentioned the use case working group. I'm a co-chair of that. If you want to join, let me know. And I'll immediately send your request to Bobby. So you could just skip that step and go straight to Bobby if you so choose. Okay, so we're going to move on. Oh, yes, you bet. There's the new guy. He wants
the new guy wants to speak up, but I just want to double down on the standards piece because, again, as the little guy up here, we talked about supply chain before. And for me, for me to have any hope at operating, I've got to go and stay inside of the standard. So, I mean, Telit's one of our big suppliers. And to the degree that I can draft off of that cell phone market, I can get product. If I get stuck having to support something where it's a one-off that's very difficult to get, I've got no chance against the big guys inside of the industry. So please stay standard.
All right, Dan?
Yeah, I think we mentioned, we're talking about the modem vendors as well and the chipset vendors. We have a lot of discussions with them as a single company. And what we tend to find is a lot of trends that they're hearing. Well, I think that's something within the alliance I think we should look at in terms of collecting what those trends and requirements are, and then going to the likes of Qualcomm and Sony Altair and saying, look, as a collective group, which has big buying power, these are the things we want to say, rather than independently saying that we need network assigned duplex for band 8. I'm sure we've all asked for that, and we get various answers, and the answers change. So I used to work at Sierra Wireless, for example, so I know what they're seeing, and it's a lot easier for them to have some kind of collective point of contact rather than various people speaking to other people, and then maybe eventually get it. But if you want to do things faster, and if you want to innovate faster, I would recommend, from speaking from their perspective, it would be a lot easier if the UBBA go to them. So requirements we see coming up, can you respond to the UBBA directly, and then you can trickle out rather than just independently poking them, which is what we're doing at the moment.
Right. And it reminds me, it's a great example of why John and others, when they conceived this idea of UBBA, this is not just utilities. This is utilities and vendors coming together for a single cause, and that is the broadband for the special requirements of utilities. Chris, let's get back to you. One of the things that we're doing with Plugfest is we're showing that there is a large variety of products that are ready today to be deployed. They are fully interoperable. That's what you'll see when you attend Plugfest or take a look at the results whenever we're done with that. There's really a myriad of combinations there. When you think of when GE, from your perspective, what sort of new products do you see coming forward that can be built upon this, like I said, the beachfront spectrum property that we've got here with Anterix, and also CBRS and other carriers?
So first, in terms of the ecosystem, so a couple comments to follow on with these guys. I think the module certification that Anterix brings to the table is the precursor to the success you're seeing next door in the Plugfest. So the concept of a certified module, then going to certified applications in the Plugfest is essential. And to the points on the chipsets, absolutely couldn't agree more, staying in the standards-based world. But I can tell you that this community is being heard. I actually got a call from a fairly large chipset manufacturer a week or two ago and said, tell me about the use case and the need for Anterix and CBRS band supported in the chipset. So it's resonating with the chipset manufacturer. So yeah, going forward, on that thread, I think you're just going to see a continued spectrum, continued products that support this spectrum. Like I said, the chipset manufacturers are on board, and continue to provide products in the 4G private LTE space, and then eventually into the 5G spectrum.
That's fantastic. And while you have the microphone, the next question I have for you is, when you talk to these customers, what are their top concerns when they're talking to you about using their GE products when it comes to building out these private LTE networks?
Yeah, they're obviously always concerned about cost. Perceived complexity of putting in a private LTE network. A lot of folks talk to us about their aging telecom workforces or exiting telecom workforces, and are looking for partners and solutions to provide next-gen systems. They have folks that are very well versed in their traditional SCADA serial networks, but don't know anything about private LTE. If you hear Saul Bright talk over the year, he talks about his perspective at Southern and how he had to transform that workforce. So that's one of the key concerns that we hear pretty regularly. And then how to design and provide a ubiquitous LTE network with good redundancy, failover capabilities. Those are the ultimately always security as well.
And I've got a follow-on question for you, and Ron, heads up, the same question is coming to you next. GE doesn't just supply these devices that we're seeing in this other room. You guys supply everything. I mean, transformers and generators and everything else within GE, and you could probably speak mostly within GE Renewable Energy. Has the LTE evolution, this idea that this is going to be the standard communications network for the deployment of these products within GE itself, is that known? Is that a thing? Is people talking about it?
Certainly within GE Renewables, specifically wind farms. So wind farms traditionally run a lot of fiber communication, and they very much are aware and desire to move towards 5G spectrum or 5G performance in order to not run as much fiber in wind farms. So absolutely. And our research center in Niskayuna is is on the forefront of working with them to develop solutions for renewable.
Okay, Ron, same question for you. Again, you guys supply literally the soup to nuts. Within Hitachi Energy, is LTE, is it talked about?
Great question. Absolutely. And I think the ubiquity of LTE is one of the key selling points, right? So we do everything from distribution automation, substation automation, asset health monitoring. So if you want to monitor your critical assets, so all of those devices have the same need, and that basic need to deliver, the intelligence and the continuous risk optimization model that we put into our enterprise software, whether it's network control or asset health, requires connectivity. And there's been a lot of choices historically, and I think what we're converging on is LTE as the standard. And quite honestly, internally, because we are a worldwide company, so it's both public and private. There's some private initiatives in Europe, not quite as far along as where we are here in the U.S. So we look at both public and private. So absolutely.
Great. Dan, on to you, but I'm going to twist the question just a little bit. I can remember, because Landis-Gyr is the solution that our utility deployed, and the first time I heard about this mesh network, I went to Google, to figure out what it is and where it came from and how it works and all that. And I thought, well, this is genius. This is fabulous. Meter, talk to meter, talk to meter, talk to meter. I did notice you get about 8 to 12 hops down. Not so good, but it's a fantastic solution for, and I think the term was used of AMI, round one. Explain to me how within Landis-Gyr you're seeing LTE and the needs that it can solve that the mesh network can't, and that's why your company's pursuing what we call under the glass support for LTE. It's got to be a little bit of a battle internally, I would think.
That's unfair, that question. That really is unfair. Actually, mesh and LTE do work together. So I'll start answering it that way. So we have customers that deploy mesh as field area, and mesh is evolving into WISM, which is standards-based, so that's a good thing. And in those situations, we're using LTE, for example, CBRS, as well as 100 megahertz as backhaul, so they work together. We're also seeing customers deploying hybrid networks, which are mesh where it makes sense, cellular public where it makes sense, cellular private where it makes sense. So that's a good defensive answer, hopefully. But yeah, the benefits specifically around private LTE, we talked about standards interoperability. So you go LTE, then how many endpoints, if you Googled it, how many LTE, IoT, and consumer endpoints are there? I don't know. We get quite a lot of answers, I think, for that one. Performance compared to a public LTE solution, you get to deploy where you want to, so you get the coverage that you need. If it makes commercial sense, you get the bandwidth and maybe even latency, resilience, reliability, and security we mentioned earlier that you desire. There's that one. The other thing I did hear yesterday, a term which I like to steal, network of networks. That's a term I kind of used in the past, but I haven't thought about it recently, but that really does make sense. So if you have many legacy networks, which a lot of our customers do, consolidating those into a single network where you only have to operate one network from now on, and then worry about one network from now on, and integrate into one network from now on, that's a good thing. So hopefully I defended mesh
Yes.
as well as introducing LTE.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right, Steve, on to you. Tell me more about this Atom product and edge computing and where you see that the benefits that this could bring to utilities building these networks.
Sure. I mean, if you think about a normal system, what are you doing? You're getting everything about everything all the time coming to it. And there are times when you absolutely need that. I mean, the example I use all the time is if you're flying an airplane, you don't want to just get a altitude low alert. You want to kind of know what your altitude is at all times. So there's times for that. But then there's a whole lot of time when you don't need to know all of the information all the time. I mean, if you mentioned the pole tilt piece. If you're looking at the status of a utility pole, you don't need to know every millisecond what the pole tilt is. You don't care. It's just useless information. What you do want to know is if the pole or any object is not normal. If it's operating differently than it was in the past, you want to know right now. If not, check in once a day, say, hey, this is what's going on. If you wanted to keep temperature logs or something else like that, upload the information. But you don't need to be bothered by all of that information. You don't need to spend the money to go and take all of that information across your systems. You don't need the integration hassles with going and putting all that stuff together. The only thing you want to know is, hey, let me know if I need to look over here. Mm-hmm. That's what the atoms do, is they take a lot of that away. Again, you know, it's not good for every potential use case, but for most use cases, you think about most equipment, things are right a lot more than they're wrong. Mm-hmm. So why not do this management by exception approach and say, look, raise your hand if something is not right, and then I'll look into it a little bit deeper. That's really what atoms do.
Fabulous. Okay. With that, before we get to parting shots, I want to give an opportunity to the audience to ask some questions of this panel. So we've got our mic runner. Who's got a question? Come on now. Don't leave me hanging.
Yeah, I have a question regarding, it was similar to the mesh versus the private LTE question we just had. The price point of the chips for private LTE, as I understand it, maybe they're 4 times, maybe more than mesh. And then the Cisco representative earlier talked about maybe asset management being a high volume, you know, deployment for poles and others. And, you know, if we are looking at such a high delta between mesh and private LTE for the chips, if it, you know, $20 versus $5, whatever that math is. And at some point, the larger utilities are going to have to put a purchase order for their private LTE system. And you do that, at some point you pull the trigger and now it's time to sign the contract. But that price difference is pretty high. Do you see with literally billions of LTE chips being manufactured and we kind of fixed the silicon problem, that price point could start coming down? The difference, if you will?
I think that's a certain amount of that answer is around maturity of technology. Because when, in particular, CADM and NB-IoT came out as technologies, they came out as being more cost effective than Cat 1, Cat 4, the traditional LTE standards, because they were cut down in terms of the silicon and the hardware that's required, even the firmware that's required. But I would say they were probably in the second generation, maybe third generation, and I think the costs are coming down. I think the other thing, particularly because the answer in Europe and APAC is different from where I come from, is different from the answer in North America, and I think it comes down to volumes as well. And I think, again, back to what the UBBA could do, it potentially could help with drive bargaining and buying power and influence to the chipset companies. Because I speak to them all the time, because I used to be part of that industry. And they're kind of, yeah, we see it happening, we start to see it happening. And we're having meetings with Qualcomm at high levels now, and Sony and companies like that, the chipset ones who are driving price as well and innovation. And we're starting to see the interest. I think Qualcomm is motivated. You probably might know why they're motivated, because they've lost Apple and they've lost Google. I hope they're not here, but they are motivated. So IoT is becoming more, I would say, I don't want to speak for them, but more of interest to them. And I think in terms of price points, I think that's something that, again, together we can help try and solve that. But I think mesh from a NIC perspective is highly cost optimized. It's very mature.
Right.
The Landis-Gyr solution is great, by the way.
Right. Well, and I like
but yeah, it is a reference. It is a reference point. Yeah.
Well, and you answered the previous challenging question so well as basically say that there is currently a need for both and deploy the right solution in the right place.
Yeah. So for courses, yeah.
Shout out to Qualcomm. I believe they are a member of UBBA. This is your opportunity. Utilities, you hear this. This is the call to action. Come talk to them. Say, look, we're real. We're here. The total addressable market. Will get their attention. Use that.
But I would say, again, we speak to Qualcomm directly. I've never spoken to Qualcomm via UBBA, and maybe we need a workshop or something like that. Maybe we should do a workshop on it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great idea.
We're in the same boat. The other thing I would say, I mean, maybe the chipset costs will never approach mesh, but I think the other way to look at it is what does private LTE enable in terms of overall cost savings? You know, the reduction of 16 disparate networks to 1 or 2 is a huge benefit that a mesh network can't satisfy all of those use cases. So there's other ways to look at the cost in addition to just chipset price.
And just building on that, I think the other piece of this conversation is just because it's standardized doesn't mean that it's in this. I think as much as possible, we want to stay close to the smartphone chipset. And it doesn't mean that we're deviating from a standards. It's not everything in the standards is in a smartphone chipset. We need to, that's the best way to leverage the economies of scale going forward.
And, you know, we use a standard cell phone chipset, so we're CADM1 as well as able to talk on private LTE. But if you really look at the total cost of the solution, I'll be a little bit controversial. I mean, the amount difference on the communication chipset is not what's driving your cost. The way that you are architecting and integrating the system is what's driving your cost. So, you know, selfless plug, if you come and look at the Atomation piece, you're going to find a solution that's 10x less than what you're used to going and spending. And it isn't because we've got some magic chip that's so cheap. It's because we're thinking about the problem differently. And I think the more that you do that, the more that you start architecting your system, back to my CIO days, that's how you really go about getting the cost out.
Great. Wonderful question from the audience. I think we've got another one here. Yeah, here we go. He's probably
It
going
won't be
to
that hard.
Plugfest starts in a little bit.
No, Matt Olson, Burns and McDonnell. A question I'd have that we get asked all the time in this space is we have NB-IoT and CADM, and there's a back and forth all the time. Seems like CADM was first with 3G. That's where a lot of this infrastructure is deployed. We're concerned about, in the utility industry, always giving up 1.4 megahertz of our potential 3 megahertz channel, half of our spectrum, to support CADM. What are you guys' opinions on CADM versus NB-IoT? Because it seems like we want a lot of things to be broadband, and then the few that we don't, we're okay with being NB-IoT and truly narrowband. Could you guys talk about where we see that ecosystem going?
Yeah. So that globally, there's this kind of competition between NB-IoT and CADM, driven partly by vendors. I used to look at Huawei, believe it or not, and we were obviously pushing NB-IoT. So certain countries rolled out NB-IoT first, particularly in Asia, South America, places like that. But North America, for obvious reasons, went CADM because there's no Huawei here, obvious reasons. But CADM was seen as the solution, particularly for public LTE, and that's where we have gone and been successful with that. And we started speaking to Southernlink a couple of years ago, and we worked out for electric as well as gas and water that NB-IoT actually was quite a good use of their spectrum. Especially we ran it in the guard band, and we've completed qualification on that, and now it's gone to the customer. We're actually now thinking, to your point, maybe that's a good option, or maybe that's more a better solution, more optimal for 900 megahertz. That's something I think we need to prove and test out. I think both technologies are suitable. Both technologies have issues, but the best, for example, when we did this testing through the Southernlink labs, we actually did things like firmware updates, because everybody knows firmware updates and NB-IoT, that's going to be a disaster. So we actually tested that, proved it, did smoke testing around it. And then by the time we left the lab, we said, oh, okay, it does work, actually. It did live up to the promise we had when we developed it at Huawei. So I think from a private spectrum perspective in North America, where you don't have that dependency on the public carrier rollout of CADM, might be the better solution. But again, the part of the ecosystem is to prove it. Let's prove it together, right? Let's find out together. Let's go through the pain together, right? Share the pain. And eventually we'll come up with something which is optimal. That's what I would say today. It might change my mind tomorrow, but today I think that sounds like a way forward.
Great. Any other panelists want to build on that? Nope. Okay. Time for one more audience question, and then we'll do final shots. Going once, going twice. Sold to the man in blue. Get my auctioneer voice. 555, give me 5, who give me 15.
And this question is more for Steve. As processing moves towards the edge of the grid, what do you see as the standards from a processing perspective? Now, how is, are we going to have the same thing where everyone has a standard for programming at the edge, versus, beauty of a standard is everyone has one, right? So I'm looking at how are we going to look at some of those applications that are going to be at the edge, and are there going to be standards associated with programming those applications?
I mean, the answer there depends upon which level you're looking at. Are you looking at it as inside of the device itself, or are you looking really from the communication standpoint? I mean, from an in the device standpoint, the answer is who knows? And as a user of the device, do you really care? Because what you're really wanting is to understand the information that's coming from it. So, from us, we've got a RESTful API, so you can pull the information directly from it. It's seamless to you. It's open. You can use the information however you want. So what's going on underneath the covers, that's going to flex and change. And we deliberately designed it that way because these things are designed to be disposable. So at the end of their life, 3 or 5 years, you get rid of it and you throw something else on. What's going on inside the box? I don't know if it necessarily matters. The key, though, is from an integration standpoint, keeping the information outside of a walled garden, not going into a proprietary protocol. That's really where everything ends up coming from, because that's how you're going to consume the data coming from the different devices, which is what really matters when you're talking about the overall top-down integration.
Great. Okay.
Just to build on that, I would say, from our perspective, providing applications at the edge, it seems to be standardizing on Dockerized containers for folks to use, Linux-based applications. So I don't see a proprietary, space at all emerging there. I think it'll stay in that standards-based Linux world.
Great. Okay, we are going to go to final shots, and we're going to start with Chris. You have the microphone. Also, the oldest company represented on the panel.
This person on the panel as well.
I wasn't going to say that.
I'm only a few years behind John, so. No, thanks for having me. This has been a great panel, great discussion. Very excited for GE to be part of UBBA and this initiative going forward. And I think we're, really exciting times. U.S. utilities have this access to spectrum, which is unprecedented in the last few years, leading the globe. Most of our work is focused on private networks here, and just very excited to be part of it.
Great. Ron?
Thanks, Mike. Again, I think call to action. Let's make sure that we understand the ecosystem, come together, drive the consolidated business case and opportunities. And then switching over to one topic that we didn't really cover, but I think in the closing shots, I think it's important to highlight, is that as the canopy coverage builds out for your private LTE networks, it's going to take time. So as primarily UE providers up here, or edge solution providers, it's incumbent on us to provide options for you at the edge of your network. So whether it's fall back to commercial cellular or various types of private networks, Landis-Gyr has those, we have those. We need to make sure that that's available so you can pre-deploy your endpoints and not have to do a truck roll in the future. So I think that's another key aspect, that how UE providers could really help you manage and optimize your capital expenditures by pre-deploying your networks.
Great. Dan?
No, I reiterate what we just said there. I mean, it's great to be part of this ecosystem. It's a very new experience for me within this industry. I went to Distributech maybe a few years ago, and I went to a UBBA session, and there was maybe 3 or 4 round tables, maybe 20, 30 people, and I thought, it's go nowhere. And now, look at this, especially the last 12 months of the way that private LTE has been really become a hot topic of all the money that's being spent, and everyone's really shown attention to it. I imagine what this is going to be like in 2 or 3 years' time. It's really exciting to be part of this.
Fantastic. All right, new guy, take us out.
New guy. The thing I would go encourage everybody to do, and this is great that we're having this discussion up here, and that it is a mix of everything from the very old companies to the very new companies. And I think it's the challenge that y'all are facing, which is the technology horizon continues to shrink. It isn't the good old days where you could sit there and say, oh, well, over the next decade, we're going to go and roll out technology X. Because by the time you're at the end of the rollout, you're already going to be 2 generations behind whatever's going on. So the idea of flexibility, trying different things, evolving with it, creating a dynamic environment that can flex and change as technology changes is going to be the way that you win, because the criticality of what you do with the grid and the infrastructure is just going to get greater and greater and greater. So this idea of flexibility and really taking some risks and moving a little bit faster than tradition, I think is going to be the key.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for attending. Want to thank this great group of panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Appreciate that.